Good morning, Ortho Pearlers. I am here with the original Ortho Pearler, a man who wrote the first book called Orthodontic Pearls. I don't know, Larry, 10 or 15 years ago. But first, a little background. I've known Larry for 30 plus years. He came and spoke right after I got out of my residency to a group of residents from Medical College of Virginia, and he gave, our foundation group brings in great speakers. And the thing I identified with most with Dr. White was his philosophy of compliance free. Now, back in the 80s, kids still wore headgear. If you just tell them, hey, you got to wear headgear, they'd wear it. But Larry was very forward thinking and thinking that you just can't tell if the patient is lying or not. And we always give them benefit of the doubt, and oftentimes we don't see results. And so he sort of developed this strategy of utilizing compliance-free mechanics. So Larry, I would like for you to just comment on how that compliance, where your compliance-free background came from and how it evolved and where is it today?
Well, everybody has the same experience working with patients. You seldom know whether they're really doing what you've asked them to do. And when one does, it just astonishes you how quickly things change. I know I had a patient just last week, a class 3 patient. I put her on some elastics, and when she came back, she was class 1 in 5 weeks. Now that astonishes me, but it does show you what can happen when you have a patient that does comply with your prescription.
That's a good point.
Yeah, it happens very quickly. So I don't know how to get people to cooperate. I've tried everything that I know how, but you're still dealing with humanity, and people are so individualistic. You just really can't predict how they're going to behave.
Yeah. So, Larry, one thing that stood out to me when you lectured 30 plus years ago was your main class 2 corrector was a device that was kind of new to our profession in terms of what we knew in the U.S., and that is the Herbst appliance.
Right.
And you were the person, I think, that scoured the literature and found Herbst's original article written in 1932. And I don't know how you found that article, but it had been buried, I guess, during World War II, or just all of the scientific literature out of Germany got buried for about 40 years. Comment on that and how you found that, and how you, and by the way, I'll say one of the things that I did, I was so impressed. I actually flew out to Dr. White's office back around 1990 and did we called them back then a field trip. I'd get on a plane and fly to someone's office and just hang out for a day. And you taught me Herbst appliances. I don't even know if you remember that. I came out with Steve Hearn. Yeah. Herbst appliances back in 1990. So comment on how you found that article written by Emil Herbst, who Emil Herbst was, because there was some confusion who that man was, because his father had the same name. So comment on that.
I discovered, I've forgotten how, but there was a resident at the University of Toronto from Australia, whose name I don't even remember now. But he got and translated Emil Herbst's original article. And once I had that in English and could understand it, it made all the difference in the world, because every problem I had had with the Herbst appliance, he had already had and had solved it. For instance, he began to use crowns instead of bands as anchors. And then he made a comment in there that the stability of the treatment depended upon sharp cusp interdigitation.
And I use that comment often when I lecture.
And that's true. Yeah, that's true about any kind of correction. If you don't have sharp cut interdigitation, typically the premolars, it's not going to hold. It's not going to be stable. I remember when I was teaching down at Baylor, one of the residents had done a Herbst, had had it in the mouth about 4 months, and the patient broke it, and she was lamenting about having to redo this whole thing. And I said, let me see the patient. I went over, saw the patient, saw that the premolars were in a firm class 1 occlusion. I said, take it off. It's done. And so that's the key to your stability.
Right.
And that's true with any appliance, whether it's rubber bands, whether it's a Herbst, whether it's a Orsus or any of these other correctors. The class 1 premolar occlusion is the key.
And I also believe, just to take that step further, why do we not use Herbst appliances, at least I don't, on mixed dentition cases? Because primary teeth are like aircraft carriers. You don't get that interdigitation, and it's just
right.
going to rebound.
Yeah. And I learned that pretty quickly. I experienced it, and I didn't understand why until I got that article by Herbst. Of course, he had been doing this since the 1899.
Right.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, Edward Engel accused him of plagiarizing his discovery.
Right. And he sent the letter to Herbst's father. Did you know that?
Yeah, I knew he wrote to him, but I didn't know Herbst ever got the letter.
He sent it to the wrong Herbst. He sent it to Herbst's father.
Well, I didn't know that, but that wouldn't surprise me. But, Engel wrote a lot of angry letters to a lot of people, and had it been for his wife, he probably would have been sued for libel very, very often. But she often, edited those letters.
Yeah, I think Engel's wife saved him probably from an early death.
Yeah, probably did. Probably did.
Hey, Larry, thanks, man. That's gold right there, just what you shared. And I used to show that article when I lectured. Herbst has kind of fallen out of favor. I think we've evolved into other class 2 correctors with all the long-term studies that show we're not growing mandibles. We're simply changing the shape, and when you change the shape, genetics rebound it. But moving teeth through the dentoalveolus and splitting the difference, half between the upper arch and the lower arch, kind of makes a lot of sense. And I think that's what most of us are doing now. Would you agree that in terms of long-term stability that you just mentioned, let's not focus on growing the mandible. Let's focus on getting the crowns and the roots through the dentoalveolus, because we can move teeth up to 3 millimeters.
Yeah, you move
comment on that.
Well, you can move teeth with bone or through bone, and we're probably doing both of those as we make these corrections.
Right.
And for instance, I haven't used a Herbst appliance in probably 20 plus years.
Right.
I've been using an MPA. That's that mandibular protraction appliance that was developed by Dr. Coelho in Brazil.
Well, that's great. You speak Portuguese and Spanish, and I dare say I use a like and similar device called a crossbow, which is Canadian. My Canadian language is much better than my Portuguese and my Spanish.
Yeah, as mine is too. But for me, it's not a matter of efficiency as much as it's a matter of cost. All of these appliances, the Orsus is over $400.
Yeah.
Hardly any of them are less than $250. All of these corrections. But I can do these MPAs for maybe $3, and it's one that I don't have to have a lab technique. I can apply directly at the chair. But it's just simpler and less expensive for me. And
Larry, if someone wanted more information, and we're really transparent here. Do you have any financial interest in the MPA?
Absolutely none. No.
So if you could share that when we're done with this interview, you can go and comment, or you could type it now how one could get more information on that device. But
There's
wait till we're done with the
the
interview.
latest article was published in Orthodontic Practice US
Okay.
about 2 or 3, 4 months ago. We wrote an article about the latest iteration of the MPA. It's called MPA 5.
Okay.
And it's simple, and it makes it so much easier to adjust, to apply, and to remove and make
Okay.
adjustments. So it's a real big step forward, and that's what we've been using.
Awesome.
So it,
That's
in
good to
order
know.
to take this advantage, you've got to make it yourself or have it made. Now, I have mine made in Pakistan. I've got a
Okay.
manufacturer over there that does it for me.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Hey, Larry, I've got 2 more things I want to cover. And thanks for sharing that class 2 perspective. One of the things I used to really look forward to before the internet was my monthly edition of the JCO. And Larry was not just one of the editors, or in my opinion, the best editor the JCO's ever had. But the reason for that is you did 2 things to that journal that were just at the time the best thing we had that relates to Orthodontic Pearl's Facebook group. And that is you wrote very just profound editorials. And you also conducted incredible interviews. And in that publication, and I really it helped mold the way I practice and the way I, not only the way my office runs, but the way I live. And one of the persons you were an early student of is W. Edwards Deming. Comment on how you found, where you found Deming, because he kind of was off the map for 40 years. Till about
He was way off the map until the Japanese automobile manufacturers started their dominance. And he had been ignored in the United States for decades. And I realized, or I found him mainly through Fortune magazine, Forbes magazine, business magazines that I read. And then I realized that he was going to be in Dallas. So I took 2 courses from him and met him and talked with him briefly. And he even had me address this group of about 500-600 people, because he made an error in one of his comments, and you didn't go to him directly. You had to go through a layer of
right.
protocol. But when he listened to me, he said, "I didn't know that." He had made a comment that you've got to play second fiddle for a long time before you get to be concert master. And I said, that's really not true. I said, most of the real discoveries, Nobel laureates, for instance, reach those Nobel prizes before they're 40 years of age. They're young people. And it's very, very seldom that someone older than that wins a Nobel Prize. If they did, it's for something they did before they were 40.
Right.
So anyway, and I said, you look at our experience with Steve Jobs and others, they do all this work when they're young, when they've got a lot of vitality. And I said, that's one of the advantages the United States has, is that we recognize youth and their ability to innovate. And I said, one of the problems that Japan will have, and of course they do, they venerate old age much more than we do here. And sometimes that happens.
That's a great message to this group, because I would say the average age, there's about 7,000 members of this group, the Orthodontic Pearls, and probably the average age is still in their 30s. So that's a great message, and I would challenge people to study Deming. There is still a large contingent, even though he's passed away, a large contingent of Deming followers that meet regularly and have courses, and you can take the whole Deming Institute course, which I've not done. I did not know, Larry, you had gone to his course and actually got to interact with him. That's amazing.
Yeah, I showed him an editorial I had written about his work in Japan,
Hmm.
and he autographed it.
Oh, that is so cool.
And
Well, I read that,
you can
and
see
I
that
read,
right on my wall there. If you look at my behind my right shoulder, you'll see
yes.
that editorial up there with his signature on it.
Well, I've read that editorial probably a dozen times,
Yeah,
and and you know, it was. I mean, some of the editorials you wrote were just gold. I mean, you are, in my opinion, the master wordsmith of orthodontics, the Renaissance man. Speaking of Renaissance men, somebody wanted me to prompt you to talk about your time at the University of New Mexico and how you played football. And I remember one time about 20 years ago, I asked you about it because I've got a whole history of uncles that coached and, you know, back in your era. And and you started laughing. You said, I played football back in the day where at the end of the game, we'd fold up our helmets and put them in our hip pocket.
yeah,
So,
that was something of a hyperbole.
yeah, I'm sure it was. But, you know, and then
One
someone
part.
brought to my attention, you're in the New Mexico Sports Hall of Fame.
Yes, yes, I am. Yeah.
So give us a quick 1 minute blurb there.
Well, we had great defensive teams from my sophomore year on, but we didn't have any kind of offense at all. In the sophomore year, I played offensive center and defensive linebacker. And near the end of that season, I was the high point man on our team. I had scored 2 touchdowns as an offensive center and a linebacker, and we didn't have any back who had scored 2 touchdowns that year.
Wow.
Finally, I think the high point man was the guy who kicked field goals and extra points. But
Wow.
anyway,
That was back when football was 3 yards in a cloud of dust.
3 yards in a cloud of dust. People didn't throw the ball a lot, maybe 10, maybe 15 times a game. That would be max. But most people were running. So this was back in 1952. And so I played from 51 through 54 and graduated in 55.
That is awesome.
I had
Most
a,
people don't know this, but
well,
Texas. Go ahead.
I was drafted by the Chicago Cardinals. Now, I was not a high draft choice, but they paid linemen at that time $3,200 a year. That was the going rate for a lineman. And I thought, my word, I can make that much barbering, and
Well, a lot of those players back then had second jobs.
oh, they all had something. They had to.
Yeah.
They had to. And it wasn't a year-round training like they have now.
Right.
But it was a different time. No face mask, of course.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I'm surprised your nose is still as symmetrical as it is.
Yeah. It gets out of joint.
Okay. Larry, we've got to wrap this up. What I'm gonna do is I want you to spend 1 minute. We're gonna call this the rapid fire lightning round. And I'm gonna name a name of an orthodontist from our past, or they may still be alive today, that I know you've interacted with. So I just wanna get your 1 minute take. I'm gonna name the name and you give me 1 minute dissertation on their contribution. Number one, Fred Schutte.
Well, he was a mentor to all of us in Texas and New Mexico. And his claim to fame was that he was the first one to recognize the importance of the vertical dimension.
Right.
And it made a lot of difference to a lot of people. And he was a gentleman. He was a great orthodontist. And his son is practicing now, and his grandson in Houston, and a great legacy that they have. And he was a great man. So we loved him, and we profited from his instructions to us. Yeah,
He was a great one.
Yeah,
I actually am treating one of Fred Schutte's one of his former patients. I'm treating their kids, and it's kind of interesting to share those Texas stories. All right, number 2, Tom Creekmore.
Tom was a preceptor under Schutte. And the first time I met him was about my second year in orthodontic training. Had lunch with him and another friend. And I realized just how much he knew, how much more he knew than I did, and how much more he understood than I did.
Yeah.
Just from that preceptorship with Schutte. He and Schutte developed the high pulled headgear.
Right.
That's where it got its origin. And he was literally one of the smartest guys I've ever known in orthodontics. And he had about the lowest tolerance for nonsense of anybody I've ever run into.
Yeah.
He used to call me occasionally for curative chats about something I wrote. And I didn't always enjoy those, but they were always constructive and usually right on. So he was.
Yeah, that's Tom Creekmore to the T.
Yeah.
I had the privilege to lecture with him one time about a year before he passed away, and it was, man, what a joy. What a brilliant.
Yeah.
You know, most people don't know this. He was a fighter pilot.
Yeah. Actually, he wasn't a fighter pilot. He was a pilot of transport. He was a transport pilot. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, Jack Sheridan, who you probably remember, he was a fighter pilot and a helicopter pilot. And
well, speaking of Jack Sheridan, the father, I have a great Jack Sheridan story. Go ahead and comment on Jack Sheridan. He was probably the most colorful orthodontist I've ever known. I had the privilege of meeting him as well.
Well, he was colorful, but he was very well read. He was probably the best read orthodontist I've ever known. His reading was eclectic. And when he was a helicopter pilot, he would take 2 sacks of books with him when he flew those crews, those oil field crews, out to those offshore wells. And he had to stay there in case they had an emergency and they had to evacuate. He would have to stay 10 days with them. And he would take 2 grocery sacks full of books and read the whole time he was there. He wrote poetry. You wouldn't think that about him, but he was just that eclectic and a great friend. He and I were in school. He was a year ahead of me at Baylor, so we got to know each other pretty well. But he was inventive.
Braintree, Essex, he was part of that.
Yeah, he started that, and then he became too time consuming for him, and he left it with this fella who was his manager there, and didn't profit from it at all. And then that fella turned around and sold it to Densply. He did profit from it.
Yeah, it still does. Okay, let's keep going down the list. Reed Holdaway, right down the road in Provo. Yeah. I remember when I was in my residency, we studied all of his soft tissue work. And so
yeah.
I understand you know him, so comment.
Holdaway probably changed my life more than almost anyone because he was the first one to bring attention to the maxillary incisor as being the key, not the mandibular incisor, and using soft tissue to diagnose and treatment plan. Now that was a huge, huge departure from whatever we were using. Everybody since Tweed used the mandibular incisor as the key to diagnosis and treatment planning. And we got a lot of terrible faces from that. And it was Holdaway who did the same thing. And he published those in 2 articles in the AJO on soft tissue. And at that time he was trying to, and was successfully doing growth forecast, and which I emulated and used for 25 years before I realized I couldn't do what he was doing, because he was making those forecasts based on 15 and 18 month forecasts. Well, you can do that successfully, but if your treatment's extended like mine to 24 and 30 months, your forecasts are not very very accurate. Sort of like a weather forecast. It's a chaotic system, and it's really hard to forecast. Just like a weather forecast of 24 hours is going to be accurate. 5 days, you might as well forget about it. It probably won't happen.
And all this was before computers and
Oh yeah,
computerized VTOs and
no.
all the big data that's gone into that forecasting started with Reed Holdaway.
Holdaway and Ricketts. Ricketts was perfect.
Ricketts, yeah. Well, I've got one more for you. I'm saving the best for last because there are two people that molded me in the way I practice today, and that's you and Wick Alexander.
Yeah.
So talk about Wick Alexander.
Well, Wick has probably the largest collection of records of anyone I know. He calls it the Room of Truth, and people visit that office. Now he's no longer working; he's retired. His sons are still active in orthodontics, but he's got probably the largest collection of records of anyone on earth, and he determined to do that from the very first. Now he was very much influenced by Fred Schutte, because Wick went to school at the University of Texas in Houston, and of course that's where Schutte lived.
He practiced. Yeah.
So Schutte treated his wife, and he got to one point and he said, "We're going to stop treatment right now. I don't have a class 1, but I'm not going to harm her profile anymore." And so he stopped, which was a good lesson at that time for people who were using that mandibular incisor as a guide.
Right.
I would say that using the maxillary incisor as a key is probably really important.
Yeah.
And the mandibular incisor really just responds to what that A-B difference is, your A-B differential. And as the maxilla gets further apart from the mandible, that mandibular incisor has to lean forward, just has to lean touch. And so Casco,
John Casco used to refer to that and wrote an article, very classic article called "The Pattern of Accommodation."
Yes, yeah. Casco and Southard, wrote that article in the Angle Orthodontics.
Yeah,
I believe it's one of the most important things ever written in orthodontics, and probably the most neglected. I hardly ever find anybody that's ever read that article.
Oh, I cite it all the time.
Yeah.
Because if you're not doing jaw surgery, you're doing that.
You got to. You have to. Yeah. Absolutely. So,
well, Larry, this has been fun. Way more fun than I expected, and we ran over. I was expecting this to be 15 minutes and wound up being, almost 30. But I dare say 1 second was wasted. This has been pure gold. And for those of you who are just now logging on and watching the tail end, you've got to replay this. This is pure gold. And feel free also to comment in the comment section long after. I know Larry's not a big Facebook guy, but I have his text message. And if you write in a comment or a question, I will make sure he gets the question and I'll get an answer and we'll post it right away. Again, it's been an honor for me, Larry, to interview you, a person who probably interviewed more orthodontists than anybody on the planet. And so with that, I want to thank you and thank you for your time. And I hope you have a good 2021 because it's going to be better than 2020.
Well, I hope so. I hope so.
Yeah.
All of us do. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Okay, Larry. Take care. Bye-bye.
Mm-hmm.